Hi, friends. We just discussed chapters 40 and 41. Um, Curzon came back. He was pretty badly wounded from his taking over the redoubt. A British bayonet attacked his arm, meaning a British soldier stabbed him, and some other minor things, twisted a knee, but he's okay, we think. And also, before that, Isabel finally came to the realization that just because Curzon is very patriotic and chooses to support the Patriots doesn't mean that he doesn't care about her. And then she finally comes to the realization that she too loves him. Very exciting for Isabel to finally let down her guard and be able to know that. We are going to read chapters 42 and 43, and then we will only have two more chapters after that, which is crazy. I'm going to try something new and read the slides, slide deck. Slide deck, if this works. Let's see. All right, chapter 42. This is a journal of Sergeant Joseph Plum Martin, Corps of Sappers and Miners. Our watchword was Rochambeau, the commander of the French forces' name, a good watchword for being pronounced Rochambeau. It sounded, when pronounced quick, like rush on boys. The blood, Curzon tried to assure me, was mostly from the redcoats. In this, as in so many things, he was boastful. The bayonet had gone through his sleeves into the meat of his arm between the elbow and the shoulder, but not all the way to the bone. I set the vinegar over the fire to heat up again and had a quite quiet word with Henry, who then went off in search of rum. As I studied the swollen messes of his knee and Isaac's ankle, the other fellows dug into my pies, which they declared were the best pies they had ever been created in all of the history of pies. I told them the secret spice I used was called hunger. This set them to roaring with laughter again. The day itself had been seasoned with victory and relief and served with a bowl of fatigue, so they were in the greatest cheer imaginable. Isaac preferred to clean his own cuts and bumps, possibly on account of the rather severe look given to him by Curzon. That freed me to clean the cuts on Curzon's brow, his knuckles, and his split lip. As I washed the dirt from his wounds and he grunted and tried not to complain, the lads told and told again the stories of the night before, whilst Ruth served a second round of my apple and turnip pies, which Bram dubbed Isabel's irresistible victuals. Our men had attacked Redoubt 10, and a French company of a similar size had attacked Redoubt 9 at the same time. I could tell he was softening the description of the action, thinking to spare me the worst of the details. Of the 800 attackers, 24 were killed, and more than 100 were wounded, broken ribs, bones shattered by musket balls, and limbs and bellies torn open by bayonets. As soon as the redoubts were in our possession, thousands of men attacked the second parallel with shovels and pickaxes, digging like an army of moles through the night. The dawn shone down on the second parallel and completed from the west and to the east, where it led directly to our newly captured redoubts. Before the sun had even warmed the ground, men were dragging cannons to the redoubts. They were pointed at Yorktown. The captain of our company, older than most and wealthy enough to own 3 changes of uniform, visited our cook fire for the very first time to check on Curzon and Isaac. He brought rum, at Henry's suggestion, to ease the painful work of the cleaning and sewing of the bayonet wound. I buttered him like a parsnip, I did, Henry whispered to me as the captain shared a few words with the heroes of the redoubt, filled in with tales of the lad's glory. He's sending along enough for the entire company this eve. Ruth and I fetched the morning bread, whilst the captain and lads exchanged tales of the night's work. By the time we returned, Henry had gotten Curzon well muddy in drink. As I approached him, armed with needle, thread, and steaming hot bandages, he gave me a lopsided smile and slurred, "Did I tell you we won, darling Isabel?" The things he shouted during my assault on his wound do not bear repeating. I made the stitches deep, necessary, close together, and tight as could be. When the sewing was done, I asked the lads to hold him fast as I poured the rest of the still warm vinegar on the needlework I'd stitched into his wound. 'Tis thought that the sharp tang of hot vinegar balances the humors within a wound and so helps with the healing. "I thought you wanted me alive," he roared. I winked at him. "Seems I got my wish." Everything happened right quick after that. Henry explained the facts mathematical to me. The cannons positioned at the first parallel had needed to fire 600 yards to hit the enemy, he said. From the second parallel, the distance was less than half of that. The guns on the second parallel fired a constant cannonade against Yorktown, an attack so violent all wondered how any living thing could survive it. By midday, Monday, Curzon's knee had swollen to the size of a sheep's head and was as hard and unmovable as a stone. I sent Drury in search of One-Eyed Christina, for she knew where leeches could be found in the marsh. He brought back a half dozen of tiny, writhing creatures which happily attached themselves to Curzon's knee. The sight of it made him puke up his breakfast. By the time darkness fell, the leeches had gorged themselves and dropped to the dirt. Thanks to the leeches, the swelling of the knee was so much reduced that I no longer feared it would split open. I stayed with him through the night, putting on fresh poultices and forcing him to drink willow bark tea. Come morning, his knee was soft as a boiled apple, tender but not fatal. Between the knee and the arm, Curzon was greatly pained, though he thought he was an actor enough to hide it from us. He tried to stand as the other fellows went off to patrol for foolish British soldiers. The entire company ordered him to fasten his backside to the ground. Tuesday was gray and unsettled. Wednesday dawned cold and wet, but the air quickly filled with laughter that spread from tent to tent, cook-fire to cook-fire, until the camp was roaring with delight at the news. Lord Cornwallis had tried to escape in the night and failed. His plan had been to row his entire army across the river. It was not a frightful distance, but as the evacuation began, the most extraordinary storm of pelting rain and violent wind boiled up and prevented the boats from crossing. It called to mind the night of the Battle of Brooklyn years earlier, when a thick fog rolled in that allowed the Patriot forces to escape capture by the British. God always seemed to provide favorable weather for the Americans, folks said. That was a sign that he supported the General Washington in our fight for liberty. Later that day, as I was sewing the tear in Curzon's sleeve made by the British bayonet, the world fell silent. Seemed as if a gigantical velvet cloak had somehow been thrown over all the things that made noise: cannons, drums, wagon wheels, hammers, saws, calling voices, shouts, and laughter. Run to the regiment headquarters and ask what news, Curzon said. I picked my skirts up and took a few steps, but he called after me. Stop, come back. You cannot have it both ways, I said. He motioned to Ruth to help him stand. I must go with you. You can barely stand, I said. I could lean on you. He put his good arm over my shoulders, gritted his teeth, and took a step. Before he could take a second, Drury and Bram appeared, running, waving their hats and hollering. The British have surrendered! What? Chapter 43. This is a reaction of British Prime Minister Lord North to the news of Cornwallis's defeat at Yorktown. Oh God, it's all over. The British did not have the courtesy to be on time for their own ceremony of surrender. The waiting Allied forces lined the Hampton Road for a full mile, French soldiers on the left side and Americans on the right. The French uniforms were crisp and colorful, while our boys seemed a bit drab and ragged in contrast, but everyone was in the highest of spirits, convinced that their sacrifices and dangerous work had struck a death blow to the war. Seeing all of the men together at once filled my heart with pride. At the beginning of the war, Black men had not been allowed to enlist, but they had continued in their efforts to do so until General Washington, the Congress, and the states changed their laws. At Valley Forge, 1 fellow out of 10 had been a Black man, Curzon among them. Our proportion was much higher now, 1 in 4, as far as I could see, with a scattering of fellows from various Indian nations. Our mother country had sons of all sorts who joined together to defend her honor. Our company proudly took its place with the rest of the Rhode Island regiment. In fact, our fellows were some of the earliest arrivals. They'd left camp right after breakfast to make sure they had enough time to get there, given Curzon's slow pace. His knee and arm would heal, of that I was confident, but he wouldn't fire a musket or chase an enemy patrol for a good while. In the days leading up to the official surrender, my sentiments had been as changeable as the wind. One moment I'd felt content around him, and the next confuddled. I'd sat next to him when the chores of the day were done. It was the most natural thing in the world for us, sitting thus to lean our shoulders against each other, sharing warmth and strength. But neither of us spoke of anything more than the weather, the pain of his wounds, and how hard it was to chew the tough meat. The strong words we had shared after the Redoubt attack seemed too dangerous or awkward to discuss. I did not regret telling him the sentiments of my heart. Of that I was almost certain. but we'd landed ourselves in an unknown country, and neither of us knew how to navigate it. Ruth and I took up our observation positions with the other women of the army in the midst of countless spectators who had crowded in, eager to watch the humiliation of the enemy who had despoiled the countryside for months. We worked our way with Christina and Sibby until we stood with Annie, the older woman we'd met the day our cannons began firing. She served several of the authors who worked with General Washington and thus was better informed than most. Annie surveyed the carriages of newcomers who had dressed in finery as if this was a fancy ball instead of an army encampment. Prognosticators and campfire politicians they are, she said scornfully, all closing up to the generals in hopes of favor and profit. Them folks, she pointed at the group of Oneida men who had been invited to observe the siege by General Washington. They are the only ones who have a right to be here. They've been fighting on our side from the beginning. Christina passed out ginger cakes that had been prepared by the baker general and apples that had newly arrived. We were seated on the ground by then, as were many of the men still waiting on the road. The British had not yet appeared. Annie speculated that Cornwallis was having his wig powdered for the occasion. The lasses around me nattered about the baby just born to a woman who worked for the Maryland Regiment and the rumored romance between an officer and a married dame in Williamsburg. I was not concerned with star-crossed lovers whom I'd never met. I kept watch on Curzon, laughing with his friends on the road, and Ruth, who sat uncommon still and quiet by my side. Knowing that they both were safe and well eased my mind more than I thought possible. I tipped my face back and enjoyed the contrary sensations of the sun's heat and the cool autumn breeze. The colors of the leaves were as varied and bright as the uniform coats of the soldiers. This was harvesting weather, the time to pick corn and thresh wheat, to store potatoes and squash in a deep-dug root cellar. We'd spent so many years waging our own wars for freedom, I'd rarely thought about the simple luxuries of an ordinary life lived without fear. Would the end of the country's war open the door for a life such as that? Finally, the drums rattled and the most anticipated event of our war for independence began. About bloody time, huffed Annie as we all stood and shook out our skirts. This delay is just another way of insulting us, mark my words. As the line of British wound its way toward us, a muttering grumble rose through the crowd like a low roll of thunder. In the gravest insult of all, Lord Cornwallis did not lead his troops to their honorable surrender. In fact, Cornwallis was nowhere to be found. He had sent his number 2 fellow so as not to expose himself to the shame of defeat. Annie spat on the ground. General Washington ought ride into Yorktown himself and drag that coward Cornwallis out by the ear. The fellow, who substituted for Cornwallis, offered his sword to General Washington, a ceremonial gesture that signified to all that the British had been fully humbled and beaten. Washington shook his head and indicated that the sword of surrender ought be given to the number 2 man on our side, Major General Lincoln. This caused a tremendous roar of approval, with many shouts and hoots from the Allied troops and spectators. After rows of officers marched by, there came near 8,000 defeated soldiers. The British were first, clad mostly in red, along with a regiment of Scotsmen dressed in their strange plaid skirts called kilts, and then the Hessians, who mostly dressed in blue. They did not march in an orderly fashion, and their regimental musicians played so poorly we all thought they were muddy in drink. The final insult was the direction of their gaze. As they passed between the rows of their conquerors, the British all turned their eyes to the French side of the road, showing our fellows the backs of their heads. Arrogant clodpates, Annie declared. Where's Aberdeen? Ruth asked me. He's not a British soldier, Poppet, I said. She'd been asking about him regular as a clock since the siege ended. But he was in Yorktown. She pointed at the column of soldiers caterpillaring down the road. They're from Yorktown. Maybe he has already sailed away, I said, trying hard to find a way to offer comfort to her. He wanted to go to Scotland, remember? She frowned, but did not answer. At the end of the march, the British threw down their muskets, swords, and cartridge boxes onto a large circle of ground. They then had to walk back between the French and American troops. As they did, they continued to insult our men by not looking at them. Some Continental soldiers were angered by the disrespect and commenced to shouting and waving their fists. Looks to me like another battle is about to break out, said Sibby. But our officers barked commands and our soldiers regained their dignity. As the prisoners, for that was their new title, prisoners of war, headed back to Yorktown where they would be kept under guard, we gathered up our baskets and canteens. Look there, Sibby said, pointing at the road. At the tail of the British forces, walking without weapons or uniforms, came their women and children, near 100 by my count. Many of our soldiers had left the road as soon as the last of the defeated enemy's forces had passed by, so the women and children attached to the British forces were accorded little notice. Our band of lasses stood with respectful attention. We understood their sacrifice. All right, the war has ended with Cornwallis's second in command's surrender to Washington. I didn't know that. I'm looking forward to discussing these two chapters with you. And thanks for listening.